Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined today by two excellent guests. Firstly by MSP Sandra White. Sandra, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you, Kenny. Good morning.
Excellent. And on the other side of me, we should have Ellen Höfer, who has just founded a new organisation called New Scots for Yes. Ellen, how are you doing today?
Very good, thanks.
And we will be coming to talk about your organisation a wee bit later on. But first of all, we have today's coronavirus figures to just update you on. I should say yesterday's. These are as of 2 p.m. yesterday. Today's figures obviously will be published in a couple of hours. But yesterday there were 141 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland. But again, another day with no new reported deaths. There were a total of 622,118 people in Scotland have now been tested. Of these, 600,929 were confirmed negative, 21,189 were positive. There were 251 people in hospital, 2 of whom were in intensive care. And the total number of people who have died in Scotland having tested positive for the virus still stands at 2,496. So that's where we are just now. But Sandra, I wanted to just come to you for a wee minute. This week we saw these new restrictions imposed in Glasgow, limiting the number of people that can meet in a household. So is this you that's been having all these house parties that have been causing problems in Glasgow?
I don't know, perhaps some of my neighbours, I'm not too sure, considering where I stay. It's worrying, I must admit, and it certainly has had an effect on myself and my family, as it has in others. I can't go and visit my sister, who, you would pop down at the weekends, things like that. I can see her outside, but I can't go to her house, or my nieces and nephews. So having came out of lockdown as such, we're back into the position we were in. But it's the right thing to do. We do have to do it to ensure that it doesn't spread any further. And I know they're talking about house parties, basically young people, but I had conversation with a friend yesterday who was saying, well, actually, Sandra, sometimes the middle of the road and between older and younger are ones who will have dinner parties. So perhaps we shouldn't be blaming all the young people all the time.
Ellen, what's been your feeling about how Scotland is coping with lockdown? I mean, obviously, lots of restrictions have been lifted now, but do you think we're coping well with the transition to just doing things a bit differently for the longer term?
I think it really depends on how you look at it. I find people are incredibly adaptive and have managed, even though it's an emotionally challenging situation, to actually stick to as many rules as they can and as they feel able to. But then there's also reluctance, and especially on behalf of more long-term decision making. We have to consider this for the future, and the future will be definitely colored by Corona. And so far, what I see is not particularly progressive in that vein. But we'll have to see how it goes.
And I know, Ellen, you've been back and forth to Germany once during this period. How do you feel the difference was from the way things are over there compared to here? Did you notice a big difference in how things are being done?
Well, first of all, the ready availability of corona testing. Anybody can just rock up, and it's possible to. You don't have to travel miles and miles. It's literally in every town and village. In the cities, there's plenty to choose from. So that's one major thing. I saw that the Scottish government announced that they were increasing their capacity to 60,000 from 40,000 the other week. But at the time, we weren't even exhausting the 40,000 capacity that apparently was there, so it seemed like a bit of a non-announcement. We could technically do more, but we're already not using the capacity that we have. And now with these new outbreaks and new hotspots across Scotland, we've had a couple of people, even in my private circle of friends and acquaintances, that have been asked to travel a really long way from South Lanarkshire, where we are, to up to Dundee to get their testing done within the next week or so. So to be fair, it's not going that great for Scotland, if I'm honest. yes, in the context of the UK, Scotland has coped fairly well, and this is not an easy time for any country. But we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to the UK in the context of this. The UK is doing horrendously, world leading in many ways. Maybe that's what they meant when we had Brexit and the world leading ambitions of that.
Sandra, on that note, there have been a few reports this week of people having to travel long distances, as Ellen was saying, to get tested. Is that something that you think the Scottish Government is getting on top of?
Well, I think we need to get the facts right in this particular one. The ones that you've got to drive into to the airports, whatever, and they're sending people, as you say, to Dundee, is the UK track and trace one, the testing one. It's a UK one, basically, where it goes into one pot and then it gets disseminated out. The one that the Scottish Government is putting forward is you can phone up. You phone up, Health Scotland, and you can get a test sent through the post. Most people I've spoken to in my constituency who have done that have had the results back within 24 or 48 hours. So there's two separate ones that's ongoing at the moment. And before we spoke about this in Scotland being asked to go to Dundee, we were having people from England being sent up to Scotland and also even to Belfast. So we need to look at the two different strands of this. I think we could always do better, absolutely always do better. I think, like Ellen, when she mentioned Germany, I would like to see being able to just go into a testing centre and, libraries, they're open now, community centres if they're open, something that's much more accessible for people rather than just phoning up to make an appointment or going to a testing centre which is supposedly local to you, but it's usually based in one of the hospitals of that. But these are the difference. If you're going to drive to a testing centre, that's a UK testing centre. The Scottish Government is doing it differently in that respect. But I still think we could do more, absolutely, in regards to more localised in a place where you just drop in rather than having to phone and wait for a test then.
Yeah, well, the Scottish Government obviously has made some announcements about expanding testing. We will keep an eye on that as time goes on. But we move on now. And the BBC appointed a new Director General this week, Tim Davie. He did choose to spend his first day in Glasgow, speaking to staff, obviously not speaking to the public. But the big stooshy that was kicked up by the Telegraph originally was this notion that he was going to be pushing for more right-wing people on comedy panel shows, particularly. The Telegraph was arguing that there was a left-wing bias and that Tim Davie was going to be pushing for more right-wing comedians. So, Ellen, I think I'll come to you first on this one. Is the problem with the BBC that there aren't enough right-wing jokes there already?
I mean, it's kind of a difficult question. I think quite a lot of people in the arts and entertainment business are fairly progressive sort of folk, and I do remember that there was one guy that I saw who said that he was a kind of right-wing funny man. I cannot remember his name. His jokes were really non-memorable either, but maybe it's just a matter of taste. Whom I'm sure that I saw on the BBC a wee while back. I think the impression that somebody who's more on the right side of the political debate will get from watching the BBC is that the BBC is pushing a narrative when really it's a matter of maybe not causality but correlation between being in a progressive sort of job environment in a very diverse and internationally influenced sort of context and be a bit more left-leaning. But then I see plenty of people on panel shows that shouldn't have no right of being there, not based on their lack of comedic merits, nor for the fact that they are particularly entertaining. So I think the BBC has done at least there what they can to balance it.
And Sandra, I mean, there's a whole question of balance on the BBC that is a kind of eternal debate. But we have seen, I mean, just on comedy panel shows, we've seen both Ruth Davidson and Boris Johnson on Have I Got News for You, both using that as a way to very much boost their political profile. But in the news sector at the BBC, we get an awful lot. There was research published, I think, this week or last, showing how much the news output is dominated by voices from business and from right-wing think tanks compared to, say, trade unionists or left-wing thinkers. Do you think this discussion about comedy is maybe a bit of a distraction from some of the real imbalances that do exist at the BBC?
I think perhaps he's trying to make a name for himself. Uh, Certainly, the one thing that always strikes me is the title they give to these people, Director General. That in itself should tell you something, I think, about the BBC. Director General is antiquated and it isn't certainly inviting. But I do question the fact that the BBC survives through taxpayers' money, paying, basically your TV license.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's up to the BBC to tell you whether you should have right wing, left wing, whatever it may be. They obviously have the ratings, they know what programmes are rated higher than others. And to interfere and say you need more right wing comedians, whatever that may be, I think it's a dangerous road to go down. People will basically vote with their feet, whether they pay their licence and watch the BBC, whether they watch other programmes. There's so much more out there. And I think it was him just trying to create a wee bit of a stushy. I would have been happier if he had came up here. We certainly got an email from him to tell us what changes he's apparently going to make or what he would like to do in the BBC. But what I'd like to see is, we pay a licence here in Scotland and we get a very small percentage of what we pay. So a wee bit more, democracy in the BBC would go a long way. But if you're talking about left wing comedians to right wing comedians, I just think we just need to look at the BBC as a whole, and it's no laughing matter that you have people like Steve Bannon and Boris Johnson, Taxpayers Alliance, all of these things, which is very right wing. And you're right, we don't get trade unions on, discussions programmes, etc. But it's really the public's money, and I don't think the Director General, in inverted commas, should have any hand whatsoever in saying we need more right wing comedians on there. It is a diversionary tactic, I believe, but they've no right to interfere in what people are paying for and what people want to watch. Public will vote with their feet, as lots have already. And I think it's a dangerous road to go down if you're going to stipulate. You've got a right wing government here, the right wing government in America, and the BBC to come out and say we need more right wing comedians. What's it going to do with them, basically?
Mm. Well, we do want to move on a wee bit to somewhere where the media is certainly a lot a lot more openly biased in the US, where Michael Cohen, the president's former lawyer, has written a book and has a lot of things to say about the president. The book alleges that Trump made a variety of racist remarks, including saying that Barack Obama only got into Columbia University and Harvard Law School because of effing affirmative action, and saying, "Tell me one country run by a black person that isn't an S-hole. They are all complete effing toilets." Now, obviously, Michael Cohen, we know, has lied in the past, so we can't necessarily take everything he says as the gospel. The White House has called the book fan fiction, but it does reiterate stories that we've heard elsewhere. Ellen, I think I'll come to you first here. Do you think this kind of book, this kind of tell-all book by a former Trump worker is going to make much difference in the public perception of Donald Trump?
I really don't think so. I think Donald Trump has kind of made it his business to have any news, be it good or bad or, slanderous or negative news, like outright offensive things. That's what he lives on. That's what his fan base lives on. I don't think any challenge to Donald Trump will come out of revelations in a book published by an ex-employee. I think it's going to have to be much more than that. And it's going to have to go down democratic and jurisdictional route. But I don't think, like, out of all the people I can think of, Trump is the last person who would be harmed by extreme media. That's what he thrives on. All the fake news are what his PR team is.
And that is an issue, isn't it, Sandra? I mean, he says here, or allegedly, as Trump says here, if it comes out about him having paid off Stormy Daniels, he says, I'm not sure how it would play with my supporters, but I bet they'd think it's cool that I slept with a porn star. It is quite a challenge, isn't it, to deal with a politician who, as Ellen says, thrives off this controversy and seems to benefit when people are attacking him for whatever he's done.
He seems to get away with anything, basically. His attack on disabled people, I mean, you don't need to read about it. You can see it on Twitter, you can see it on YouTube, the way he treats people, misogynist, homophobic, allegedly. But we see it there. And I think you've got to question yourself, who is he playing to? This narrative, which has been created in America, has been created by him. But when you have only a couple of people controlling the media in the world, particularly in the Western world anyway, here as well as in America, that again is a very dangerous road to go down. And unfortunately, he whips up this frenzy. You've seen it. He whips up this frenzy. And we can also see it here in the UK. Look at Dover just the other day, people down there, what was it, 600 people down there. The police had to move them back, basically down there about asylum seekers. So it's moving across the world, and we need to call it out wherever we see it in that respect. And we also obviously have it here as well now, where you've now got Tony Abbott, who's a misogynist, who's homophobic, the ex-Prime Minister of Australia, who's now the UK trade envoy. So it doesn't just, it may have started with Trump, we may think it had started with Trump, but it's moving across the world. And that's something we need to call out. And I think Ellen is right. He thrives on this. But also, whether we believe in what's in the book, his ex-aide or whatever, it's something that's got to be published. We can't have the right wing homophobic, misogynist, racist people being the only one that's there in media. We need something to be able to counteract that. And Donald Trump, well, there's a lot of sensible people in America. They're not all like that. And that the media shows you certain things, but they don't show you the rallies against Donald Trump. And that's what we're against. That's what we're up against, basically, because the media is controlled by five billionaires, basically, and they are controlling it with fake news and everything else. So I don't think it will affect the way Donald Trump acts, but I think it may affect his polling ratings. If only we could get some of the footage of the rallies against Donald Trump, that would balance it up. But unfortunately, because they're controlled, we don't get it.
And Sandra, this is something we've discussed on the show a few times in the last wee while. This question of kind of this worldwide movement towards the right wing. We've seen a lot of strongman, almost dictatorial type figures emerging all over the world. We've seen it in Brazil, in the US, in Turkey, in Russia, and even here to a certain extent. This kind of very populist right-wing narrative. Now, Scotland is subject to all the same media influences, all the same propaganda. Why do you think Scotland has not seen the same rise in that kind of right-wing populism? What do you think is different in Scotland right now?
I think, we still get bombarded with the media, but we have, very good people who will put stuff out on Twitter, etc. It's the only way we can get the news out, by putting out our own thoughts. But there seems to be a greater sense of awareness in Scotland, perhaps a greater sense even of community. And I go back to the very beginning when asylum seekers first came here, dropped in Sighthill. People woke up in the morning, didn't know what was going on. And through hard work, I must admit, between police, council, elected members and the community, we got over that and they were actually integrated, and it's been going on ever since. So I think in a way we have a greater sense of community. We still have our pockets, don't get me wrong, everybody knows we have our pockets, but collectively we seem to have a more social conscience in that respect. Smaller country perhaps, I don't know, but we seem to have a more social conscience in that respect, and our governments obviously, who are elected Scottish Government at the moment, comes out on behalf of social justice and people as well. So we have people we can, look up to and to follow in Scottish Government, people in those positions who counteract this right wing narrative that's going about. And we talk about sweeping across the world, it certainly is. But when you look at Donald Trump, you look at Boris Johnson, they're buffoons, absolute jokes and buffoons. So who's controlling them? The media. They're easily manipulated for populism. That's the difference, I think.
And Ellen, having been brought up in Germany, there's a kind of an acute awareness built into German education of the warning signs of fascism. Now we're seeing in the States, militias organizing, for example, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where we saw that young man shoot to a couple of protesters. How worried does it make you when you see that kind of thing in the supposedly kind of democratic Western world?
I mean, it's not just the US. The UK is showing very indicative and strong signs for a definite step towards the fascist right. You just need to look at how Brexit was fought and how immigrants and migrants and EU citizens got all rolled up into one horrible wall of fear. How does it make me feel? It makes me feel like I'm proud to be part of a modern nation who has had to face its responsibility. I like to, when I speak to people about this, I like to remind them that it's not my fault, but it is my and everybody else's responsibility not to repeat the past, and that's how we have to tackle this. But yes, the same is true for the UK. The same is true for quite a lot of places around the world. The step towards the right is part of a natural up and down that goes on at all times. But the extremities of how that swing goes, to me, is very clearly connected to local democracy and whether it is there or it isn't. To the question that you asked, Sandra, I think it's important to remember that Scotland has a good reason to be the way that it is. On the one hand, you have experienced as a nation quite a lot of affronts to your personal democracy and to the equality that you feel within this non-union. But there's also a very strong need to differentiate yourselves from the rest of the UK. And if that means not being as racist as England or Wales or anybody else, if it means not being a certain kind of way, then that is something that there's a vested interest in Scotland to demonstrate not being. So I think it's a bit of both. It's having lived experience as well as having the need to prove that we are not like them.
Okay, well, we come back to Scotland now, where Richard Leonard, the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland, has been facing a very difficult week. He's had numerous people calling on him to resign on the basis that he's not doing a good job of reviving the fortunes of the Labour Party. So, Sandra, all this kind of political squabbling, backstabbing, I mean, it's something that we've seen a lot of in the Labour Party for a long time. Is getting rid of Richard Leonard going to make a difference, do you think, to how the Labour Party does in Scotland?
No. In one word, no. I don't think it will make one iota of difference. The Labour Party, as you say, are in disarray. They are fighting, like cats and dogs amongst themselves. And it's all based on the list system and the elections that's coming up. They know that they are going to go back down the polls again. It wouldn't matter who led them, as long as they have this narrative of they do not believe in a referendum. Basically, Scotland's the people's right to choose. That goes very much against the grain. And the Scottish people have grown up. They're probably the most sophisticated electorally. They know more about politics. And you see it when you're in the Parliament. You know, someone from Labour will go and get up and speak. They don't even clap or encourage them. It's quite strange to see that. Even in the Parliament, when they sit there as a group, they are not a group. They're all divided, all bickering and fighting amongst each other. And they are desperate to be able to get on the list, first in the list or second in the list, to ensure that some of them will come back. And I think Richard Leonard actually said that the people who had spoken out against him may find it difficult to get a position on the list. So it's all about survival. In some cases, survival for themselves, not necessarily survival for the Labour Party. And I don't think it would matter who you had in charge of the Labour Party in Scotland, because basically they're still a branch member of the UK Labour Party. It would not help their fortunes. I wouldn't like to be in Richard Leonard's shoes. I've spoke to Richard Leonard. He seems a perfectly decent guy when you're chatting to him. His politics are not mine, obviously, but he's going to stick by his guns. And you know, basically, it's not doing him any good. He will be out before the next election, no doubt about it. And I can't think of anyone. I know there's 3 or 4 different factions in the Labour Party squabbling, but I can't think of anyone who would take over his position, elected or otherwise, that could revive the Labour Party in Scotland. They're finished, they've been finished for a number of years, simply because they're not putting Scotland's in, they're not listening to the voters. They're not putting Scotland's interests forward, and the only future for the Labour Party is to become an independent Scottish Labour Party and start from that premise and give the Scottish people what they want, and that's a referendum on independence.
Ellen, the Labour Party in Scotland has burned through a lot of leaders, especially in the last few years. Each one has been kind of promised as the brave new dawn of the Labour Party, which has been in more or less constant decline since the year 2000. What's your feeling about this? Do you think there is somebody who could kind of shake up the Labour Party, could change its direction, could make some sort of difference to where they are? Or do you think changing the leader is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic?
I think it's really a crisis of identity for the Labour Party, especially in Scotland, especially because most of the Labour voters are now more interested in independence than the union. So actually not changing tack, and the same goes for the members. Not changing tack is a calcification that the Labour Party can just not afford. But the leadership position in Scotland is basically an ejector seat. So in that sense, yes, every new leader is a brave, but maybe not a new Dorn, because they are brave to sit in a seat where they're not going to be able to make the changes necessary in order to make Labour a viable option at this point in time. I do really hope that Labour and all the other parties that we currently find in Scotland will revive and understand the need to bring new and constructive policy suggestions to an independent Scotland's debate. It is their responsibility, and I can't imagine that neither the Conservatives nor Labour would be able to come up with anything once we're independent. I don't think that there'll be bugs lying on their back and wiggling their legs in the air. We are all capable of coming up with new policies for a new reality, and that's what everybody should be focusing on as best as they can. But for Labour, with the whip from Scotland, from London and from the UK behind them, that nothing's going to change for them. They aren't offering a new case and nothing constructive. The union is it's a losing ticket.
And Sandra, on that note, is there a problem for the SNP if the Labour Party and the Tory Party, which in fairness is not holding up especially well in the polls under Jackson Carlaw and now Douglas Ross, is there a problem for the SNP if the opposition parties are so weak that, as Ellen says, they can't put forward any alternative vision, they don't have any real policy proposals, they're just there kind of shouting, not the SNP. Is there a problem for the SNP if that debate isn't happening in Scotland?
I think I wouldn't say the word problem, but I do think it's unhealthy if you do not have a decent opposition. I do think it's unhealthy for that. But the problem is really with the unionist parties. The Lib Dems have just come out and said they're not for a referendum. They've changed their tune now. They're basically supporting Brexit as well. So you're left with the SNP, the government, and obviously the Greens who support independence as well. But I do think it's unhealthy not to have a proper opposition. But the problem lies with the unionist parties. They have went down this narrative, even when, I'm not saying they were successful, but they were more successful than they are now. They never came up with any viable ideas. And if the SNP government came up with the viable ideas, they would say they had pushed that and they weren't supportive of it at that time, but they maybe pushed it previously. So the problem is really with them. They've got to get their act together and become a decent opposition. The only problem would be the narrative that the media put forward in that regards. But I mean, I would turn it on its head. If you're, giving the people what they want, basically, and the people are supporting you, then really the problem lies with the opposition, who are not opposing or coming up with any ideas whatsoever. So I don't think it's a problem for the SNP. I wouldn't like it to be that you had just only two-party state or whatever it may be, which with the media would push it as that. But the unionist parties have got to take the majority of the blame because they have nothing to offer the Scottish people apart from attacking the SNP, and therein lies the biggest problem.
Ellen, on that note, what do you think the solution is? Is there something that you think the Labour parties and Tory party, the Lib Dems, could be doing differently now, or do you think this is something that just won't be fixed until or unless Scotland becomes independent?
I am afraid it might be that way, though to be fair, Sandra's absolutely right, and there's a responsibility and a danger, a sort of unhealthy imbalance without a proper opposition. Let's not use that excuse to not push our own policy abilities. Just because nobody's chasing us down doesn't mean Scotland shouldn't be leaping forward into the future with some, constructive ideas, even if they aren't being chased by the unionist parties. I don't think that the unionist parties will really get there, though we can see that there's a wee wobble around the independence argument. You can't have a referendum at all is now starting to shift to, can we move something about the terms of the independence referendum? Like, these people shouldn't be included, these people should be included in the franchise. And we're starting to see that pressure is building. So even the parties will be feeling that at some point they will have to make a case for what they're making a case for. It's anybody's guess how the union is going to be made to look attractive to Scots at this point, especially because the whole devolution lie has already taken place and has not, had the effect. Well, it had the effect at the time, but it hasn't had any positive consequence for Scotland. So I don't think Scotland will be fooled 6 years later, 7 years later, 8 years later. We've been there.
Now we are speaking about Labour leaders and their fate, and also about the possibility of an independence referendum. And this week, Kezia Dugdale, the former Labour leader in Scotland, speaking in her new role as the director of the John Smith Centre for Politics and Public Service, she said they, meaning the SNP, are likely to have a majority in a parliament which is not designed to produce majorities. And a byproduct of that is that there will unquestionably be a second independence referendum. If you look at current independence referendum polling, there's been a considerable shift from no to yes, around 5 or 6 percentage points in the last 6 months. And at the same time, we discussed this in depth with Delith Jewell, the Plaid Cymru member of the Welsh Assembly, on our show on Friday. But Mark Drakeford, the Labour First Minister of Wales, said, I am very clear that if a population in Scotland, or indeed in Wales, wanted to hold a referendum, it's for the people of Wales and the people of Scotland to make that decision. No Labour leader should argue that the component parts of the UK can be prevented from navigating a future for themselves. Now, that, of course, was the position that Jeremy Corbyn tried to take and then was very quickly shouted down by Ian Murray, amongst others. Sandra, do you think it makes a difference to have people like Kezia Dugdale and Mark Drakeford making this kind of statement when the Labour leadership in London is so adamantly opposed to a referendum?
I think it does make a difference. I think it makes people ask questions. I mean, here you have Labour politicians, or obviously Kezia Dugdale, not so much now, basically in her current role, listening to people out in the real world, basically, in her role now, listening to people who's come to that conclusion. You know, you have Labour in Wales saying if Scotland and Wales go forward, then it's up to them to decide that. And it really reinforces the argument that in a democracy, and particularly in Scotland, the people are sovereign. So it makes people think and question, why is it that Labour, who are asking for election to the Scottish Parliament, are not coming out and saying the same as Labour in Wales, or even at the time of Jeremy Corbyn? It just doesn't make sense. There's something, what is it that makes them think that we should constantly be subservient to Westminster and not have our own say? And people now, particularly since COVID, have saw all the facts and all the figures, and the way governments are doing it differently. They start to question, more and more people have questioned the fact, well, actually, Scotland can go alone. And they question the fact that elected Labour and Unionist members here in Scotland are so against Scotland having that democratic right, when you've got Labour in Wales and then obviously Jeremy Corbyn previously saying it's up to the people. It just doesn't make sense, and I think it's very helpful for people to come forward. And I think it was Mark Carney as well, former Bank of England. These people are coming out and saying that, and yeah, it's good. It's good that it opens it up to further discussion, but it also gives it a wee bit more of a push for people to learn. I just can't understand why they cannot allow Scotland, the people are sovereign, to go forward and make that decision for themselves.
Yeah, Ellen, we heard this week as well, Ian Murray had considered leaving the Labour Party, joining the Change UK group, that long and thriving party that we saw for a few months last year. What do you think this question does to the Labour Party, where there are obviously elements in the Labour Party who can see that arguing against the right of the Welsh and the Scottish people to choose isn't helping. But there are some people like Ian Murray who are so absolutely determined not to allow a vote at all that they're actually doing harm to the party. Do you think there's any chance of this debate being resolved within the Labour Party?
I think it will be resolved for independence for either Wales or Scotland. I was quite heartened, and I've been heartened for, let's say, the last 2 years or so. We've seen huge changes in Wales and the support for independence there, as well as the practical steps taken. Wales has proved itself to be a sort of sponge for good policy, often taking water from Scotland. And sucking that up and making it quick and effective policy in Wales. And that's a really important step to take. For Labour itself, though, I don't think, if we consider the roots of the Labour movement, this is like a Labour movement, the workforce, there's a lot about worker solidarity in the roots of the Labour Party. And as far as I know, they support pretty much any independence cause around the world, just not in Scotland. I think that should be an indicator that this is about a sort of ideological struggle within the party, but not really about independence. This is about power and control, because it's a brave thing for the Welsh Labour leader to come out and say this. It endangers the case in Scotland, and I'm sure he's as much on an ejector seat for saying that as people are for starting to become the Scottish Labour leader. It's a brave new start into the same we had before. This is really pushing the envelope, and it's it's interesting. The opinions that are being held about independence for Scotland and for Wales are opinions held in London and not in England or in Scotland or Wales. So that's where the discontent in the party comes from. People want to keep the status quo, but there's as much as there is a lean to the right in democracies around the world for lack of local democracy. The same is the case within the Labour Party. There is no local democracy, and if that endangers your career and endangers the party in the parts of the country that you're trying to run, then you are going to create a fissure, a fracture between, comprehensive, smart progress into what is a very Labour stance to technically hold versus we don't want anything to change, even though we're in a terrible situation. Let's just hold on to this.
Okay,
Can I come
well.
in there, Kerry? So can I come in there, Kerry?
Sorry,
just
yes,
to
Sandra.
say, sorry, you wonder what happened in the Labour Party when you look back to Keir Hardie. Why don't they learn the history of the Labour Party? Keir Hardie believed in self-determination for the Scottish people, and yet they seem to have forgot that.
Yeah. Well, we could probably talk about the history of the Labour Party all day, but we don't have time because we do have to move on. And the last really successful opposition leader in Scotland of any kind was, of course, Ruth Davidson. And this week, Ruth Davidson became very upset at the idea of people referring to her as Baroness Davidson, because obviously she doesn't want people to think about the fact that she has accepted a place in the House of Lords and will be able to collect payment for that until the day she dies, despite having a plan to step down from elected politics as of May next year. Sandra, is it wrong of us to refer to Baroness Davidson as Baroness Davidson?
Absolutely not. I think the more you call Ruth Davidson Baroness Davidson and remind her that that is going to be her position is a good thing. People should know exactly what's going on. I mean, the House of Lords should be abolished anyway. You can be there for life. It's unbelievable. It's the second largest legislator in the world, bigger than the EU. It's the second largest legislator in the world, bigger than the European Parliament. So I'll certainly be calling Ruth Davidson Baroness Davidson whenever I get the opportunity in the Scottish Parliament. If you don't want to be called it, you shouldn't have took the position, the title. Simple as that.
Ellen, what about you? Do you think it's unfair to call her by her title when she just wants to be just ordinary wee Ruth, everybody's pal?
Oh, clearly she doesn't want to be that. It's just the role that she's decided to take on. I can understand why it's really uncomfortable. This independence thing is much more about class and the divisions between working class and middle class and upper class sort of lifestyles. And a baroness just doesn't sound all that working class or middle class. I'm sorry. No, I will be referring to her as Baroness myself too. And I think it's important that we start this as a matter of consequence.
Well, you mentioned the independence debate there, and obviously that's been reignited this week by the announcement in the programme for government that there is going to be a draft bill on independence published before the election. We're expecting around March time next year, with a view to a referendum being held fairly shortly after the election. Now, this week as well, Ellen, you have launched your new organisation, New Scots for Yes. Could you tell us a wee bit about that? What's the goal behind setting this organisation up?
Right. So first of all, it's a campaign coalition. It's also not mine, but it's. I just kind of felt it was time to tackle this. We're 6 years away from the independence referendum in 2014, and if we're honest and if we remember what happened at the time, native Scots voted for independence. New Scots weren't convinced and in many ways weren't part of the debate as much. So I feel like it's the right time to get together and kind of unite New Scots organisations behind New Scots for Yes. This will be a forum to campaign together, a forum for exchange, a forum for the rest of the Yes movement to come and get information or support in case they're intending to campaign towards New Scots or have specific questions within the movement. We also have some concrete plans that we'll be launching on the 18th of September. I'm sure the date sounds familiar. That will be our first campaign goal. And we think it's really, really important. We're just working on the details for that, and we'll release the actual details at the time.
Now, I know you've been obviously a member of EU Citizens for an Independent Scotland for a long time. What do you think is missing, perhaps, from the independence movement in terms of how they understand how New Scots are engaging with the debate?
I mean, if we talk about New Scots, we're talking about people not born in Scotland. That includes English people as much as it includes somebody who's moved here from Ghana or from, New Zealand. And New Scots make about 13% of the population of Scotland. That's not insignificant. The problem is that when you look at any independence poll since 2014, the question about independence when it has been asked in polls, has never been broken down beyond Scottish, English, and other. So that could include a Welshman as much as it could be including somebody from South Africa or from, South America or wherever. It's not a particularly homogenous group, and usually the numbers for others in these surveys are incredibly low. So one of the things that is clearly missing is actually like an up-to-date understanding of these 13% population people that we're talking to. The fact that has changed has also to do with the Scottish government and the electoral franchise bill that got put into law at the end of last year, in November. And it basically has enfranchised near enough every person living in Scotland unless they are an asylum seeker or a prisoner with a term time of more than 12 months. But more or less everybody else is included in the electoral franchise, especially for the Scottish parliamentary elections and for local elections.
Mm-hmm.
There is a bit of a imbalance here because the referendums bill that was kind of sent through the Scottish Parliament at the same time actually doesn't contain the same franchise as the electoral franchise bill now does. The referendums bill only includes what had been included in the franchise before in 2014, which is 16 and 17-year-olds and EU citizens who lost their right to vote in Scotland through the loss of EU rights. That had guaranteed and enshrined our right to vote in law. So there's a lot of intricate detail. There's a lot of problems in the independence movement as well. We haven't really faced up to the differences that in data quality. We haven't really talked about who the roughly 200,000 people are who we've just enfranchised less than a year ago and what might be their political will. We don't know who is registered to vote. We do know in 2014 being registered to vote, especially among New Scots, is a really complex issue. A lot to do with identity and Scotland's identity. Do we have the right as foreigners to participate? And it will be up to the independence movement and political movements in general to make sure that now that we have made such a huge leap to one of the most inclusive franchises in the world, Scotland really needs to ask its residents to take this civic duty and participate, because we have kind of resolved the whole no taxation without representation, but we can't really represent if we don't participate either. So this is why New Scots for Yes is here. We're gonna be there to represent and to be heard and to shape the debate and to campaign in the right direction. I don't want to have to go through 2014 through that experience again, and also face the fact that other people didn't take the call, didn't include foreign nationals as much as they should have when they are such a huge and vast area of potential for votes for independence and for the country that we're trying to build in the future.
Well, let me turn to Sandra on this. Sandra, I mean, I had a friend in 2014 who wanted to vote and had an opinion about what Scotland's future should be. But she was born in Poland, and she felt that as an incomer, she didn't really have a right to vote, even though obviously technically she did. And people told her that, but she ended up not voting. How is the Scottish government going to encourage people who perhaps are in that position, who are new to Scotland, that they do have a right to participate and that their voices are important?
You've hit the nail on the head, as Ellen had, going round doors. And Glasgow Kelvin is a pretty diverse community, had the same issues, people from, different parts of the EU, both in Poland and other places, exactly what you have said. They wanted to vote, but they felt because they weren't, basically born in the country, even though they had the right to vote, they felt they shouldn't interfere in how the country is run. And that was a big stumbling block. But I think you talk about the Scottish government. Yeah, obviously we can pass legislation and give guidelines, but I think the beauty of what Ellen is saying, that it's coming from the people themselves. It's coming from the grassroots of New Scots. Ellen obviously works very, very hard, in that field. And I think that's the key. We can give guidance, we can put forward legislation, but we shouldn't be talking down to people, or they may seem to see it as talking down. I think the secret lies in what Ellen's doing and the fact that she is a New Scot. She'll be speaking to other New Scots. I think that's the key to it. Too many times people have went into other countries and told them this is the way you do it. It doesn't work. You've got to listen to the people on the ground. And Ellen's idea is absolutely fantastic. Scottish government will back it all the way. But I don't think we should be interfering with it. I think we should let Ellen get on with it and the other people that are there, because they will speak on behalf of and to these other people, and they can probably explain it a lot better than I or anyone else in the Scottish government can do.
And Sandra, the question of who gets to vote obviously has been discussed by the other side of this debate recently as well. There's been ideas about giving the franchise to Scots who no longer live in Scotland. How much traction do you think that particular idea can get?
I would think no traction or no support. I'm reminded of Ellen's comments just earlier on. No representation without taxation. We have now got over that. And if you are living in Scotland and you're paying your taxes, then you have a right to vote. But I'm also reminded I did an international observer in Venezuela, and people who lived anywhere else in the world could come and vote. And I was on a plane with people, Venezuelans from America, etc., coming to vote. These were rich people. These were people that could afford to go and they lived in another country, but they could afford to fly to Venezuela to cast a vote. Most of them were not in favour of Chavez, and that's very skewed. If you live in a country, you pay your taxes, you'll get a right to vote and say how that country is run. You shouldn't be getting a vote if you do not reside in Scotland.
And Ellen, kind of the same question to you. Do you think that this idea of Scots who live in London still have a right to a view on Scottish independence? How does that argument work for you?
It doesn't really. I still have a democratic vote in Germany, but I do not participate there, frankly, because I don't know very much about the German political landscape at this point. And I don't have a local candidate for me in Germany that could sway my vote. I don't believe I should be allowed to vote. My vote should go to somebody who's actively in the country, who's participating in shaping the future of that nation, who's affected by the changes in law and rule. And I can empathize with the point that Scots feel connected even when they're abroad, but that is the reality that we're trying to create, that wherever you are in the world, you should shape the democracy that is yours and part of your immediate experience. If you're upset that you can't vote in Scotland on independence, maybe you should be more upset that you're not allowed to vote in the country that you're staying in.
Well, Ellen, what can people do if they want to get involved with this organization? Is there somewhere people can reach you?
Oh, absolutely. We have a Twitter account, we have a YouTube, a Facebook page, You can get in touch via email, but the Twitter account is at New Scots for Yes. And we're looking forward to seeing you there. Basically, so far, the organisations that are on board are EU Citizens for Independent Scotland, New Scots for Yes, Germans for Indie, and several private individuals who also have a New Scot background. We're inviting anybody to come along, and we'll work together and just agree this is not meant to be a hierarchical space, but a space for communication. And to go back to something that Sandra said earlier, I'm really thankful for that support and that you enjoy the idea. But I do think that the Scottish Government, having extended the voting franchise to more people in Scotland, and in the last 10 years, we've seen a huge fall in voter registration through the reforms of electoral franchise law. It is really incumbent upon the Scottish Government to make a strong campaign registering people to vote that is as inclusive as possible. This is not something that the grassroots can or should have to stem.
Is that something that you think the Scottish Government will be pursuing, Sandra, of trying to get more of these people registered?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it makes sense, and I stand corrected by Ellen in that respect. As I said, there's certain things we can do, and that's one of them. And certainly that should be the top of the agenda. Come up to a referendum, and I'll certainly raise that, Ellen, through the group with the Scottish Government. But I think it's something that's obviously on their minds at the moment as well.
Well, that's,
Yeah,
I think...
it's a really...
oh, sorry, no, go on.
It's a really current topic because of the Holyrood elections. That's the first instance where almost all of Scotland, I mean, think about it. It makes my heart glow with warmth. Almost all of Scotland can go to the polls in May next year. And we should really be taking care to get as many of us there as possible. This can only forge a stronger society to go and forge the future of this country together. So let's do it.
Well, that is quite a way to end the show. So that is just about all we have time for. So thank you very much to Ellen Höfer and to Sandra White for joining us. And thank you at home for joining us as well. The shows wouldn't be worth making if we didn't have an audience. We do have to ask, if you're able to support us, then please do follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. Find us on Facebook. Find our YouTube channel. Subscribe to that channel. Like the videos there. And then share the shows around with people. That's how we build our audience here. If you're able to support us financially, we would urge you, please, if you can, to go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter. And your £5 a month helps us to keep building, keep growing as a broadcaster that we believe Scotland needs. And finally, if you'd like to get involved here, there are always jobs to be done when we're looking at an election and potentially a referendum happening next year. We are going to need all the bodies we can to make Broadcasting Scotland able to cover that in the way that it deserves to be covered. So if you would be interested in getting involved in producing TV for Scotland, then please do get in touch with us. We have lots and lots of ideas. We just need a few more hands to start making them happen. But that is absolutely all we have time for. So once again, I'd just like to thank Sandra White MSP and Ellen Höfer from New Scots for Yes. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you. Gordon will be back again tomorrow at 7. I'll be back again on Tuesday with Scotland at 7 then. But until then, thanks again for joining us and have a brilliant day. Goodbye.
Thank you.